Good afternoon. Thanks for coming out. Welcome to the final installment of WARF's Entrepreneurons series for this semester. My name is Laura Heisler, and I am WARF's Director of Programming, and we are delighted to present this series to you. I wanted to give you a couple of housekeeping notes about how this program goes before turning things over to our speakers for the afternoon. So for those of you who got an email about today's program, we're going to send you a survey tomorrow asking for your feedback on this session. We would greatly appreciate that. And then because we're winding up this semester, we're going to send everyone who attended an Entrepreneurons this semester a survey as well, asking for your feedback on the series and thoughts about future directions that the series might take. Also, we do record all of the WARF Entrepreneurons sessions, and so if you're interested in catching up on any that you've missed this semester, last semester, or over the past couple of years, you can find all of those on the warf.org website or on the discovery.wis.edu website. And because we record this, we're going to ask you when we get to the Q&A portion of today's session to raise your hand and wait for one of our mic runners to reach you so that we can capture your question on the video. The last piece of housekeeping I want to mention is all Entrepreneurons conclude with an informal networking reception where you can talk to the speakers a little bit more and talk to each other. We just ask that you put on a name tag so that we know you're part of today's session and not just someone who was walking through and wanted to grab a drink. So we do appreciate that. We are bringing you this session on navigating conflicts of interest on campus as a result of conversations that took place as we put together the last session, which we held last month, focusing on the top 10 challenges of starting a technology-based venture on campus. And one of the conversations that came up as we were talking with all of the presenters last week was, well, conflict of interest, that's such a big topic, we're not even sure how we should broach that. And we thought, well, let's go to the experts on campus who actually do that work every day and have them bring sort of a command performance to round things out for the semester and give everyone a sense of how approachable and manageable and well thought through the conflict of interest process really is. And so to that end, we are delighted to welcome both Stephanie Leroy and Sam Limeweber from the UW-Madison Office of Research Policy and Integrity. Both of them have been at UW-Madison for 3 years. Stephanie received her JD from UW-Madison Law School in 2014, and Sam received his from the University of Chicago Law School a year before in 2013. Both of them work on financial conflict of interest, institutional conflict of interest, and research misconduct. So this is their day job, this is what they do, and we couldn't have better experts. And then they're going to invite one of their clients, who also happens to be a WARF inventor and a faculty member here at UW-Madison, who has a very exciting startup, Doug McNeil, to talk through some of what the lived experience is of working with this team on managing conflict of interest. So with that, I'm delighted to turn things over to Stephanie and Sam.
Thank you. So here's our contact info. We're trying to keep this presentation pretty general and not bog you down in details. So if you have something specific, please let us know and get in touch with us. So I thought I'd start this presentation by going over some of the regulations we work under. The first set of them that's pretty important is federal regulations that apply to each institution that receives PHS funding. And I put a note in there for people who might receive SBIR or STTR awards. And we also have, sorry, double-clicked. We also have UW's COI policy, and that's based on federal regulations, state law, system regulations, and guidance from accreditation bodies such as AHARP. UW's policy is therefore a bit broader than the PHS regulations we work with, and it applies to all federally funded research or any research involving human subjects. So this is further reflected in our OER or outside activities reporting requirements, which apply to all faculty and academic staff at 50% or greater. That is due to state laws and anybody who is subject to the COI policy. So if you're not a faculty member or academic staff and you're subject to the policy, that means you're either key personnel on federally funded research or are somebody who's listed as a study team member on a human subjects protocol. So generally that would mean you're emeritus faculty or a student. Um, so the OAR requires you to report all outside financial interests that relate to your institutional responsibilities. And we should think about this pretty broadly. So if you're doing entrepreneurial work or you're consulting with somebody, it's probably because of your expertise. So it would be something that's reportable. But we shouldn't take that too far either. So, for example, if I were hired to work with people to work on uh, RFPs or something, so government proposals, I'd report that. But I also train dogs, and that's not something I'd report. And I think Doug or other people I work with would be pretty offended if I thought it was. So as you can see, the individual obligations aren't that burdensome or great. So we already talked about the OAR. And basically, if you don't hear back from us, all that you need to do is keep it updated. And this means that you need to report a significant change within 30 days of it happening. A significant change would generally be something where you reported it before and it wasn't managed, and now it would go over the threshold where it's something that needs to receive management, and we'll go over what can bring that about on the next slide. If you have relationships with outside enterprises, for example, you're now sponsored by a company, so some of your research is, and you already have a financial interest with them, that's something that you should report and probably alert your dean's office or department chair about. Um, and that's about it. So here's our COI process. It's pretty straightforward. So we look at OARs as they come in, and then we check to see if there's federal funding or human subjects research. If there's not, we won't review that person unless there's a specific request to. If the relationship is ongoing, we'll keep on going down and analyzing it. But if it's not, generally, there's not going to be a management plan assigned. And then we look at the financial thresholds, and those are off to the left. And we'll go over them a little bit more on the next slide. But essentially, if it's a private company and there's more than $5,000 in compensation or ownership, they'll go over the threshold. And for public companies, we combine those two things to see if it goes over $5,000. So that's pretty much the key number to be aware of. Other SFIs might be if you're somebody who has fiduciary responsibilities to the company or entity, and that could be considered a significant financial interest in some ways as well. So if all those things are met, we'll look to see if there's a broad nexus between that company and your institutional responsibilities here at Madison, and then we make very broad or conservative recommendations to the committee on whether management plans might be necessary. So as I was saying, these are defined by federal law and state law or UW system regulations, and they're pretty simple. So for publicly traded entities, we combine compensation and the value of the equity. And for non or private companies, we look at compensation and whether it goes over $5,000 or if there is any equity at all in the company. And some people, especially with startups, get a little bit annoyed with that, and they say, well, this isn't really worth anything. But I think it's a pretty good bright line policy and rule because one, federal regulations say that's what it is, but also the value of a startup or a small company can change overnight. And you also probably don't want me to be the one doing evaluation of your company or verifying it and turning over, financial records. So it's a little bit simpler from that point as well. As Stephanie and I had to value all the companies that are reported and all the startups or check on them, there'd be quite a bit of delay and back and forth. And I think those financial records might even be subject to open records requests, so we probably wouldn't want that. The other things we look at are intellectual property. So that would mean any income from IP that is not coming from WARF, or service in positions with fiduciary responsibilities. So if you're on the board of trustees or an executive, you'd have a responsibility to that company that might conflict with your research or responsibilities at Madison. The next thing to look at is whether there's a very broad nexus between the company and your work at UW. And we don't look at the precise activity that you're doing for that company. So somebody might be hired to advise people at a food company about FDA regulations. And they come to us and they say, hey, all I'm doing is some educational work, what gives? But the point is to look at that company's commercial interests and how that could potentially affect or bias your work here. And that's quite a bit greater. So if you're working in food sciences and you're consulting with craft, even if it's educational, it's still something that the committee needs to consider and look at. We also try not to get too bogged down in specialist opinions. So if your company is working on lung cancer and you're working in a different area of oncology, that's not something that the public would generally make a distinction about, and that's part of the goals of our management plans and the regulations. So we consider that in assigning these things, but we're also not extremely broad. So my favorite example would be a radiologist, I believe, who had an interest in a toenail fungus company. We don't manage that or consider that to be a sufficient nexus that requires a management plan. Stephanie is now going to talk about the management plans and what the requirements are.
As Sam said, I'm going to go through what our standard management plan is and the different components of it, just to give you a better idea of if you had a management plan, what your responsibilities would be under them. So first, what is a management plan? Well, it's just an institutional recognition of best practices for faculty and staff who are required to follow that addresses social and governmental concerns about financial conflicts in federally funded and human subjects research. So at UW, we just have one standard management plan. We don't have multiple plans for multiple situations. So if you're in radiology, you have the same management plan as someone in geology or any of our letters and sciences. And most of our management plan, we review it every year to fine tune it, and we benchmark with other universities to see what's working for them, just to make sure that we are managing any possible bias in our research. And some of the key aspects of our management plan include disclosure, and that includes in publications and to students and staff that you work with in the course of your research. And in publications, we really want you to disclose when the entity that's being managed might have a commercial interest in the outcome of that research paper. And the same thing with presentations. So if the company that's being managed might have a commercial interest in the presentation, you're going to want to make that disclosure at the end of the slide. And for students and staff that you work with in the course of your research, we just require an email disclosure to go out once a year and CCing the COI program saying that you have a relationship with a particular entity, what that relationship is, and if they have any questions or concerns, to just contact either the designee in the school or college or the COI office. And we provide an example of a letter at the end of a management plan, so you're not just going blind on what you have to write and send to your students and staff. So we also have restrictions on participation in human subjects research when the entity is either sponsoring the study or owns or licenses technology in the study. And since that one is usually of particular concern to people, I have a bit more on that on future slides. We also have provisions for oversight for purchasing and research support. So if you're going to make a purchase from a managed entity, you're going to need to get permission from your department chair, or if you are a department chair, from your dean or director. Same thing with research support. If you ever need to get research support, or if you're lucky enough to get research support from an entity that is managed for you, then you should just get permission from your dean or department chair, so there's a proper paper trail. We also have special considerations for researchers' time, effort, and commitment, and that really goes to making sure that all of the university work is completed before you work on any outside activity. And then we also require an annual review with your department chair, and that's just something that you can print off of the OIR homepage, and it just is a checklist of things that you've talked with your department chair, and they sign it, you sign it, upload it to us, and that's just a once a year requirement. But we find that's really helpful in making sure all the parts of your management plan are being followed. So, like I said, we do have a restriction on participation in human subjects research. So, on studies that are greater than minimal risk, an investigator is prohibited from being PI or key personnel on a protocol at UW when the managed entity sponsors the study or owns or licenses the technology used in the study. And it's important to note that the entity can be either the licensee or the licensor. So if WARF holds the patent and you're using that technology in your lab, and then your company also wants to license that technology from WARF, that is something that would prohibit you from being PI on the study at UW without an exception. So that doesn't come up too frequently, but it's coming up more and more that it's something I wanted to point out. But just because we have this restriction in our management plan doesn't mean that you are ultimately prohibited from being PI or key personnel in the study, because we do allow exceptions to this prohibition, but only under certain circumstances. The most important thing is you definitely need your dean's office support, because they will be the ones writing the exception request to the COI committee. So that's the first place you need to go, is to your dean's office to explain the situation and why you think that you are uniquely qualified to participate in the study. And then they will either say yes or no and help you write the memo to the COI committee. But in order to write the memo to the COI committee, you will need a fully developed protocol. And that's mainly because you need the exception before the IRB will approve your protocol. And we don't want the protocol changing drastically after the COI committee has granted the exception, because then that really changes the nature of what the research bias might be and the risks to the participants. So, and in terms of being uniquely qualified, just having written the grant proposal does not make you uniquely qualified to be a part of the study. I know people have tried to argue that before because they're tied to the funding, but that doesn't make you uniquely qualified. You have to either have developed a process that no one else can do, or you invented either a procedure or a piece of equipment that you are and your lab members are experts at using, and that it'd be time consuming and prohibitively expensive to try to bring in other people to do that same research or have it done at another university. So that typically means that exceptions are limited to phase 1 trials, but more recently we have had more phase 2 trials being granted exceptions, but it really is just case by case, and it all depends on the circumstances. So that was just for greater than minimal risk studies. If your study is determined to be less than or determined to be minimal risk, then there's already kind of an exception built into our management plan for you. So you can participate as PI or key personnel as long as you disclose the conflict to the participants in the study, and that's something that will just be done on consent forms, and the IRB will help you write that language. And you are not allowed to participate in the recruitment, enrollment, or consent of participants in the study. And that, I think, we've decided is going to be a firm no, at least for the time being. We used to allow minor exceptions to that, but we're probably going to stick with not allowing people to do that in minimal risk studies. And then for a clinical trial, where the managed entity either sponsors the study or owns or licenses technology used in the study, you have to have a non-conflicted co-investor or key personnel on the study who's responsible for acting as independent reviewer of the data analysis. And that's just because clinical trials are automatically a greater risk to the university and to participants. And that's something that we'd put in our regular exceptions, as well as having an independent data analysis done. So that's most of section 3 of our management plan. So the other parts of our management plan include research support, which I already kind of touched on. But research support, we interpret pretty broadly. So it includes gifts, grants, equipment, and other funding, and that includes awards from the company to the university and from the university to the company. So if you have an SBIR or STTR, or your company wants to give a microscope to your lab, that's something that you will need to get permission from your department chair and probably ultimately your dean's office, because we are concerned about self-dealing, which is I'll get to a little bit later, and we just want to make sure everything is above board and that we can track where all the money is going to and from. So UWS 8, along with Wisconsin Statute 946.13, deal with contracts with the university and how much money is being transferred between the managed entity and the university. So if the sum of all of your research support is expected to be $250,000 or more in any 2-year period, you'll need additional clearance from the Board of Regents. So you should really be contacting your dean's office or director well in advance of you ever hitting this mark. If you've ever worked with RSP is pretty good about noticing when contracts are going to go over that threshold, and they'll get permission from the regents. The regents don't meet even on a monthly basis. They only meet every 6 to 8 weeks. So it can take extra time to get permission if your contracts go over the $250,000 mark. And that also includes money going from the university to the company and from the company to the university, just like research support. So it would include any other additional subawards that are coming and going from the university. So again, with purchases, most of our management plan is just going to be university policy reprinted in our management plan, but we like to put it there as a reminder to our investigators that these are things that are important to remember when you're working with an outside entity, even if it's your own. And purchases is definitely one of them. If you ever need to make a purchase from your company, you're going to want to get permission from your department chair or director. And that's just because this definitely leans towards our self-dealing laws, and other universities have had problems with this to the point of where their investigators have gone to prison because they've tried to make purchases from their own company to the tune of like $1.5 million without getting permission, and that just looks really bad. And that it should be pretty obvious, but I'm here to say it to you again. If you need to purchase anything from your company, please get permission from your department chair and dean's office. So we do have a few more considerations when dealing with management plans and just general outside activities on campus. So everyone who is engaged in federally funded or human subjects research has to take our COI training course, and it's required every 4 years. So most people, if you've been around campus, you've probably taken it twice now. It's currently in Learn at UW, but we're moving over to Canvas within the next month or two, for sure by the end of next month. It's just a short online training that we ask 10 questions at the end, and you either pass or you don't. You can keep taking the quiz until you pass. It's a really good refresher if you have any questions about COI, because we give scenarios there, and so you can test your knowledge. And when it concerns students, fellows, and trainees, there are additional requirements if you want any students to be researchers for your company or do company work on a UW grant. So we do require that students meet with their advisor and their dean's office at least once a semester to make sure they're making appropriate progress towards degree, because our ultimate goal is to get our grad students to graduate. We don't want them to start working for an outside company and then decide, oh, this is the greatest thing ever, and stop their work at the university and go work for the company and never graduate. And especially with startups, they're so volatile. If it doesn't go well, then the student has nothing to fall back on. So we really take students working with startup companies very seriously. We do allow it, and we don't necessarily discourage it, but we do want to make sure there are appropriate protections in place for the student and even the company. And then the last thing I wanted to mention was about time commitments and the Wisconsin idea. So the Wisconsin idea definitely encourages engagement with the outside world. However, it does not sanctify outside activity at the expense of carrying out UW mission research, teaching, and service. And understanding the balance of research, teaching, and service with outside activities needs to be assessed and maintained. Department chairs really are your first line of defense, or first line of assessing the balance between working with your outside activity and your university research. So that's the person who's best able to determine what your outside activity allotment should be. For some people, it might be too difficult to even have any outside activities and be able to get their university work done. But we do recognize the importance of outside activities. A lot of the relationships that are started because of an outside activity bring research support back to this university. So we do encourage it. We do encourage faculty to have startups, because that is just innovation at its best, and that's exactly what the Wisconsin idea embodies. So before we go into the question portion of our presentation, I did want to, I can invite Sam and Dr. McNeil back up to the stage. We've asked Dr. McNeil to be a part of our panel to be available for these questions, and I'll just give a little introduction for Doug. Dr. McNeil is an associate professor in the Department of Medicine, Division of Hematology Oncology at the University of Wisconsin. Dr. McNeil is a genitourinary medical oncologist with a laboratory and clinical research program focused on prostate cancer, immunology, with the goal of developing anti-tumor vaccines as treatments for prostate cancer. He serves as co-leader of the Experimental Therapeutics Program at the Carbone Cancer Center. And Dr. McNeil has served as PI or study chair for multiple clinical trials and co-investigator for multiple other trials for patients with genitourinary malignancies. Dr. McNeil is also the chief scientific founder and chief medical officer of Madison Vaccines, which is what I will let him tell you more about in just a minute. So thank you, and we'll get towards our question portion of the evening.
So I guess I'll lead this off, trying to figure out how close I need to be to this mic. Anyways, so when Stephanie and I have met with different people around the Madison area who've tried to work at the university and be entrepreneurs, we've heard that experience really helps get things going smoothly, and I was wondering what types of strategies you'd suggest if you're to start a company or somebody who's just starting out. Like which people on campus would you talk to, and so on.
And maybe I'll frame this a little bit. I might give a very sort of a long answer to your question and ultimately end up there by just giving you a little bit of a history about kind of how we ended up here where we are. So And I've heard myself referred to as an entrepreneur a number of times, and I actually don't think of myself as an entrepreneur. I mean, if I'd wanted to go into business, I would have gone into business, but I came to the university because I like research and I like teaching, and that's my primary mission. It's just that the area of our research kind of overlapped with these multiple areas, and that was the best way to go forward. So my research lab, we've been interested for 20 years in vaccines as treatments for prostate cancer. And we were really interested initially in do people with prostate cancer have immune responses to individual proteins of the prostate. And this area 20 years ago was very much of an orphan, neglected, it's never going to work kind of field. And it's really been within the last few years that immunotherapy was named as the scientific breakthrough of the year in 2013. So it's really taken off, and we've been kind of in the center of all of this activity going on. And where we were 10, 15, 20 years ago was looking at what's antigenically recognized. We identified a number of these things and disclosed them to WARF. And then realized that if we're ever going to test these, we needed to set up a series of phase 1 trials in people where we could ask whether we can immunize and target specific things. And that's where we were from a scientific direction. And I'm a physician. I see patients with prostate cancer. I had this connection in the clinic, and ultimately what I want my research to impact patients that I'm actually seeing. I want these things to get out. But I never envisioned that, I thought we would just be doing a series of basically experiments in this kind of an arena. And we started a phase 1 trial a number of years ago and actually saw that patients responded, and it seemed that patients that got this actually did a little bit better. Well, that's worth pursuing. And that's part of our mission at the university, to take new therapies and put them, and get them out of the university. And so this is where everything kind of started to align. So in 2012, we started a company, and it was really WARF making those kinds of interactions to identify a CEO with, that had the business skills. I mean, I don't know business, and here's part of my long-winded answer to your question. Identify people who know what they're doing, and I'm not a business person, so you need to identify somebody that has the business acumen and that you trust. And that was a big thing, is actually identifying people that I trust and that know that end of things and trusted me to know the science. And we started this really with a partnership of the company would work on commercialization of directions for research that we're doing at the university. And so then we have sort of patient care, clinical trials, and the company interests that are all kind of there. It's not a conflict of interest, it's an alignment of interest. It's figuring out how to get that to work with appropriate oversight and making sure that everybody is doing the right thing and it's supervised. So that's really kind of where we started this. So back to your question, how do you find, there isn't a really good roadmap, and I think everybody's path is a little bit different throughout this. I think very early on, there were a few investigators. I see Jamie Weichert here. Jamie had started a company and was very instrumental in just how did this work, and how do you kind of negotiate through the system through the university. There were a few other physicians as well. I would say that most clinical research, there's clinical research going on as well as laboratory research. And in the Cancer Center, there are hundreds, literally, of clinical trials going on. Most of these are an investigator taking a compound from a company, and it's a sponsored research agreement. Our interaction of taking things right out of the lab and putting it into people was a little bit different. That involves what's called an investigational new drug, or IND application. I think there was a recent counting that there are about 20-some INDs on campus right now. Only 3 of them came out of investigator labs, and I think I have 2 of them. So we were kind of negotiating uncharted territories at the time. One thing I would say is that throughout this whole process, actually, the conflicts of interest team I mean, they're your friends, because everybody wants to make sure this is done in the correct way with correct oversight. So I think the university has really been adaptive to figure out how to make this work. Okay, thanks.
So I guess my next question would be, what would you do to minimize potential conflicts if you were starting another business venture? Knowing what you've gone through already with our exception request process and trying to use technology and sponsorship on campus.
Some things I think are just unavoidable, just as I kind of mentioned how things were developed. There was an initial experiment, I think probably 10 years ago, where some of our technology was licensed out to a third party, and I had no conflict of interest because I had no say in anything that was going on. And frankly, the science didn't move forward because they needed really my involvement. And so it never gained any traction and never went anywhere. And so I think with a lot of developing technologies, frankly, the inventor has to be kind of involved because that's the only way to shepherd things through. So I think it's not about avoiding the conflict, it's about making sure that there's appropriate management over it. So in the context of, so I have a management plan, and what that means is that there are certain things that for example, anybody on clinical trials, it's stated very clearly in the consent forms to patients that I have a potential conflict and I don't see patients, I don't enroll patients, I have nothing to do with the clinical care of those patients, and all of the management of the trial from a clinical perspective is managed by other people. But it's impossible really to be divorced from the laboratory perspective. And I'll give you an example. So we started a phase 1 trial where we're investigating a new target, and the company had ownership of this. And I think the Conflict of Interest Committee said, well, any of the laboratory evaluation of that should be done by a third party. And we said, well, we're using entirely new techniques to do this. We'll have to train them how to do it. They'll charge us 10 times the price, and we won't trust any of the results coming out of it. So it really, I think an exception was granted for that, but again, we have oversight so that anything that comes from that research has oversight from other faculty members reviewing publications, reviewing presentations that I give to make sure that, that things aren't, being told in a different light than what we have.
So speaking about the management plans, quite often when I meet with people, they're pretty intimidated by them. And I was wondering, which sections were you most worried about when you got the plan, and which ones were a bit easier than you thought they would be?
I'm trying to remember. I don't think the plans are so complicated. A lot of it's just telling how did this arise. And I think the major point is that they both highlighted is why is your involvement essential to this? And I think that's the major thing. And it's spelling it out, also being able to identify what are the potential biases and how are these mitigated. So I think those are the major points.
Okay, were there any types of surprises that you encountered while working with the university, either through the COI process or the clinical trial process, or surprises within your company working through that process at UW?
No real surprises. It's a big organization, and all of these processes take time. I think that was maybe the biggest surprise. Clinical trials cost a lot of money, and so we quickly approached the $250,000 limit, because even small trials can cost millions of dollars. So we quickly approached that, and I think that was probably one thing, because we'd anticipated that, but we couldn't actually file it, and then it had a two-month delay, I think, or something for the Board of Regents.
So would you say giving yourself additional time in any part of the process would be a good idea?
That's a very good idea.
Always add additional time.
Absolutely. And I think anybody doing human subjects research is used to scientific review and IRB review. Sometimes we have also institutional biosafety review, and there's a conflict of interest review, and all of these things, and a lot of the committees meet every month. And so all of these things take time.
That's all we have for initial questions of Dr. McNeil. So we'd like to open it up to the rest of the audience. We left specifically a lot of time for you guys, since it sounded like there were a lot of questions from previous presentations. So if anyone has a question, please raise your hand and they'll come to you with a mic.
Rob Radwin from the College of Engineering. So Sam, you used the term commercial interest a number of times, but you didn't really define that. Can you tell us a little bit more about what commercial interest means?
Sure. So, if you had a plan, I think prior to 2014 or 2015, I think it used to say that you needed to disclose your conflict in publications and presentations, and that was it. And then shortly after starting here, Stephanie and I got a call from an agency, and they were looking at somebody's PubMed publications, and they went through all of them and actually compared disclosures, and they found that sometimes one management plan or conflict was reported in one and not another. And it became clear that they were thinking that it meant the public or the management plan or conflict always needed to be reported, and that was never the intent of the committee. So we worked with the committee to try to figure out when a management plan might be relevant and need to be disclosed. And what we settled on was when there was a commercial interest involved. So that would be a direct commercial interest. So a company's product might be reported on in the publication or tested, and then you should definitely disclose it. But it could also refer to competing commercial interests. So if you're reporting on a competitor's product, for example, it might be a good idea to report your management plan.
So I guess a real life example of that would not from this university, thank goodness, but there was a researcher who was researching global warming and if fossil fuels contribute to global warming or not. Well, on the side, he also happened to be consulting for, I think, ExxonMobil, and he wasn't making that disclosure in his publication. So while Exxon wasn't necessarily sponsoring the study and they weren't using any technology used in the study, he still should have been reporting his relationship with Exxon in the paper because Exxon was directly benefiting from his paper saying that fossil fuels do not contribute to global warming.
So I want to follow up. So that's where it gets a little murky, and a better definition of commercial interest is what I'm looking for. A lot of us who do research in topics that that not only society can benefit from, but a company that we might be thinking of starting up might benefit from the knowledge that's derived from that research. Is that a case? And that could be very broadly defined. So I'm looking for some more specific definitions that would exclude, just general knowledge that gets published, but that a company that a faculty member might be starting up could benefit from that knowledge that's generated, but it might not necessarily be that there's a relationship between that company and the research sponsorship of that research that's being done.
So we brought that issue to the committee when we were discussing the rules, and we had some brighter lines laid out, but they didn't like them. I think they were looking at the ICJME guidelines, which are also pretty vague. So I would suggest that as long as you have a good or defensible reason for disclosing or not, that's generally going to be enough. Another thing to bring up is that if you disclose to a journal and they choose not to publish that disclosure, just save it. And that's all we need, because basically we just need to be able to report to an agency why it was not disclosed if they ask us about it.
So really just use your best judgment, and if you are really concerned about it, feel free to contact us and we can work through it with you.
Joanne Oravec, University of Wisconsin at Whitewater, down the road a bit. I'm wondering about the transparency of this entire process. You've been talking about transparency in terms of showing various allegiances and conflicts of potential conflicts of interest in the journal articles themselves. But I'm wondering about people who would like to drill down a little more, somebody who might suspect something, a reporter. a faculty member who's worried about the direction of a department would be going and all that, and would like to look at some of the paperwork that's being written there. You're talking about deans making certain statements and allowing some things to go one way or the other, and all this other paperwork. And I'm just wondering, can somebody get a hold of that stuff? How transparent is the entire process along those lines?
So everything we do is still subject to the open records laws. So as long as people would need to make a specific request for that information, we might have to turn it over. It really is up to not our office, but we work with Lisa Hull in
So she specializes in open records requests.
so we are able to redact certain information in particular situations, but not always. We don't get a whole lot of requests for outside activities reports or anything else involving conflict of interest, but it does come up occasionally, and our outside activities reports are subject to open records laws.
Hi, I'm Tom Mulholland from mechanical engineering, a PhD student. So I was wondering, when you get to the point where you're an investigator on a federal grant, and you also have a company that's now involved in the research in some way, how do you go about dealing with IP issues? Yeah, from your perspective.
So anything that's done at the university, IP is handled by WARF, and anything that's done purely from a company perspective is companies' priority to how they wish to disclose IP. In my particular situation, the company doesn't have any lab, so everything and anything that's so they're not really generating new IP. Anything that might be relevant is maybe being identified, and they may or may not look at that IP that goes through WARF. And we're doing other things from the university that may not even be relevant for that company. That situation may be different depending upon how companies are structured. Correct.
Adel Talat, Vet School. This is a question for Doug here. You are a PI and also running a lab in UW-Madison and also have a vaccine company. I'm sure you have several situations where you really have to, or several examples you can give us, where you distinguish between what you do with UW and how you separate this, the work at UW and the work at the company. It will be great if you can share this with us so we can learn.
Sure. So all of my work at the university is primarily laboratory focused and training students, and I don't have there's nothing really that's being done by the company that's even in the lab, if you will, because the direction of the company is just looking at developing clinical trials. So that activity is very much separate. So my involvement with that is just how are they doing, what types of clinical trials might be designed, and they're funding clinical trials. Some of those trials are taking place at the university, but I'm not involved in the trial. Some of those may be involved or may be taking place at other places. So like I say, I don't have people in the lab. I don't have students or trainees that are working for the company, for example, or anything like that. So those distinctions on the primary research is different. And that's how I see the distinctions.
Jennifer Gottwald at WARF. I had a researcher tell me, I don't know, within the past year that they felt that sometimes people we're more likely to not do an activity rather than to have to declare a conflict and go through the review and perhaps do a management plan. And I could see that maybe happening. So I'm wondering what your office does to kind of get rid of the perception that managing a conflict of interest is necessarily a bad thing, or it's too much trouble to go to, or if you ever look at the management plans you have in place and find out, do newer professors never do them? Is it only, established professors who will do them? Do female professors file them at the same rate as male professors? Or look at anything where the system might be discouraging people from interactions that can be managed?
Yeah, so we definitely have, and we've made quite a few changes to try to make the management plan less onerous, and the outside activities reporting less burdensome as well. So we've worked with IT on developing new software that we're going to be hopefully launching this year before this fall semester. Other examples would include, it used to be the case that every single time you filed an OAR, you were assigned a new management plan and you needed to go online and check the box and accept it again. And we no longer require that. People are also having issues with online software and accepting the plan. So we're now allowing people to sometimes send us an email saying they accept it, and we take screenshots and use that as documentation. So we worked with legal and the COI committee to make sure that was okay. In terms of the notifications, it used to be the case that everybody who needed to receive a notification about your management plan had to sign a copy saying that you reviewed it with them, upload a PDF to the OAR website, and we now allow those to be done via email. So you can just send it to everybody, CC the COI program, and then we can see exactly what was sent, when, who received it, and then signatures are no longer necessary. So we definitely welcome feedback and are trying to figure out ways to make it much easier for people to do these things. And we are also trying to do meetings like this to show that the management plan is basically just notifications, and that we only go into more in-depth management in certain situations regarding human subjects research.
And we definitely, like I said before, we encourage the participation in outside activities, especially because those relationships, they're something really great for this university to build on. We get a lot of sponsored research from it, so we don't want to discourage anyone from doing outside activities if it's something that they want to do and they think they can benefit from. And I should say that we plan on going on an education tour this fall when we do launch our new software tools. And our new tools should be supporting proxy users, so you can have, if you have a lot of outside activities to report, you can designate either a secretary or someone else in your office to be able to at least fill in the information, and then you can just go back in, check it, and submit it on your own. So hopefully we're trying to make the OAR process save people more time with it, because we do understand that filling in the same information over and over again can be, it's just not worth your effort sometimes. And we're trying to move away from that and make it more user-friendly, and especially with our management plans, trying to reduce the burden, because our management plans aren't supposed to put a lot of burden on you and restrict your research. That's not at all its intention. We're trying to protect you as a researcher and protect the university from undue bias, and that's really our ultimate goal.
Jamie Weichert from Radiology. Having met with both of you in the past, I appreciate what you guys bring to the management plan process here. My question is, I'm not really sure what your specific role is. Who do you guys report to, and what is your role specifically with the
So we report directly to the Associate Vice Chancellor for Research, Policy, and Integrity, which currently is Brian Fox. And we are really supposed to be, so we guide the committee. So we do the initial review of outside activities reports and make recommendations to the committee based on what we've reviewed and what we think should be managed or should not be managed. But we rely on our committee's expertise ultimately for the decision of management, because we're not scientists, we're lawyers by training, and our committee is made up of faculty and staff from throughout the university, and so we rely on their expertise in their field to make the final decision of whether something should be managed, because we might not know if there's for sure a nexus, but they probably do.
Hi, that's me again. A question regarding I really appreciate the conflict of interest management plan. It really makes sense, and I understand your point about not the burden on us. But there is an issue when we talk about the limit of sponsored research from the company to the lab, and up to $250,000. And I just need some clarification. Does this include subcontracts and grants that we do? Because sometimes the company submit a grant and subcontract with the lab at UW. And also, why it's $250,000 every 2 years instead of just $125 a year? Because sometimes it gets confusing when you are starting the grant in the middle of the year and so on. And this kind of make confuses, at least for people like us.
So that's a state law that we have no control over. I think the university actually worked with the legislature to try to get a new bill passed. Unfortunately, it failed.
Well, they just didn't vote on it in time. The Senate passed it, and the House just didn't get to it before break, so it just died.
So we'll see if that changes in the future. In terms of the subcontracts, my understanding is that those do count. But I would work with your dean's office or legal to make sure all the timing is understood best.
Sam, I might be able to comment on that, because myself and Rock Mackey and Dick Burgess actually testified on behalf of the university for that bill, which has been named the Mark Cook bill, appropriately named. And they are in the process. One of the things we were pushing for was to increase that number to $1 million, which would still be fairly small. As Doug talked about, the cost of clinical trials, $1 million doesn't even go very far. 10 trials here, and I can tell you it was probably $50 million over the entire time period of 10 years. But it is a start in the right direction of increasing that number, because that number is restrictively small. And what the point of the bill was is that the university loses a lot of business with companies who are just taking those trials elsewhere instead of doing them here. So it's an important bill. It will be taken up again in the next session and readdressed, and got full support through both the Assembly and the Senate, and then it got dragged down at the end of this session. So it'll arise again, and hopefully it will pass the next time. Just a comment on that.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Any other final questions?
Okay, well, if there's no further questions, please join me in thanking Stephanie, Sam, and Professor McNeil. And then you guys are gonna stick around a little bit for the reception, so if you wanted to ask a more detailed question in private, you'll have the opportunity to do that. So right behind you, we'll be having appetizers and beverages, so please stick around. Thanks.